What if I told you that the secret weapon of a Nobel-winning physicist wasn't actually his genius? What if it was just a simple habit that really anyone could learn? We're talking about Richard Feynman, one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. But his real superpower? It was something deceptively simple. So let's pull back the curtain and see what it was.
Okay, you've probably seen this quote everywhere, right? I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. It's powerful, it's elegant, and it just perfectly seems to capture that whole spirit of scientific curiosity. It feels like it has to be the perfect summary of Richard Feynman's entire philosophy. But what if the story isn't quite that simple?
Well, here's where the story takes a little twist. Researchers, they dug through everything, his lectures, his letters, all his interviews. And what did they find? Absolutely nothing. That iconic quote you see shared all over the internet, turns out it's a myth. So what he actually said was this: I can live with doubt and uncertainty and not knowing. I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers which might be wrong. See the difference? The myth, it sounds kind of defiant, almost like a challenge. But the reality, what he really said, is so much deeper. He wasn't looking for a fight against bad answers. He was just genuinely comfortable living in that gray area, He saw embracing doubt as a more interesting and, frankly, a more honest way to experience the world.
All right, so if that famous quote isn't the key to understanding him, then what is? Well, Feynman's real secret wasn't some clever turn of phrase. Nope, it was his relentless, unending habit of asking incredibly basic, almost dumb questions.
I mean, just try to imagine this. You're in a room with a Nobel Prize winner, and he's the one asking questions that sound like they're straight out of a high school chemistry class. He wasn't doing it because he forgot the answer, not at all. He did it because he absolutely refused to build his thinking on top of shaky, fragile assumptions. He had to start from the absolute bedrock of truth every single time.
And this habit, over time, it actually became a method that anyone can use. Here's how it worked. First, he'd take a really specific example of some complex idea. Then, he would just bombard it with the most basic questions imaginable, testing every single assumption he thought he had. It was only after he was left with facts that were totally unshakable that he would even begin to build his understanding, piece by piece, from the ground up.
And this really gets at a powerful metaphor for learning, doesn't it? I mean, think about it. So many of us are taught to just nod along, to pretend we understand something just to avoid looking foolish. But that kind of knowledge is, well, it's fragile. It's like building a house on sand. Feynman's method is the exact opposite. It's about laying a solid foundation, one solid brick at a time. Yeah, it's slower, it's messier, but the understanding you end up building, it's practically indestructible.
All of this points to a really fascinating paradox when you think about it. The smartest way to learn, it isn't about proving how much you already know. It's about being brave enough to admit how much you don't know. It's about showing up with an empty cup, ready for it to be filled. And this next quote, which, by the way, is one he actually said, pretty much sums it all up. I'm smart enough to know that I'm dumb. Now, this wasn't some kind of false modesty. For him, this was his core operating system. It was this deep, fundamental awareness of his own ignorance that, paradoxically, is what made him so incredibly open to genuine learning. And there's actually a name for this mindset. It's called intellectual humility. It's the engine that drives all true discovery. And it's the polar opposite of something you might have heard of called the Dunning-Kruger effect. That's where just a little bit of knowledge creates this dangerous illusion of expertise. Feynman just got it. He understood that real wisdom only begins the moment you recognize the vast, vast limits of what you actually know.
So this is all great in theory, but how do you know when to ask that dumb question in the moment? Well, you could think of it like a quick cost-benefit analysis. What's the cost? Maybe a brief, fleeting moment of feeling a little foolish. Okay. And the potential benefit? A massive gain in real, foundational understanding. So if the answer to your question is fundamental to everything else that's being talked about, it's almost always a bet worth taking.
Okay, this brings us to the ultimate test of Feynman's entire philosophy. It all went down in a legendary BBC interview, where one single simple question pushed the very idea of what an explanation even is to its absolute breaking point.
The interviewer asks a question a kid might ask, right? Why do magnets attract each other? And Feynman, he starts to explain. He's talking about electromagnetic forces, about electrons, a clear, solid, scientific answer. But then, the interviewer had a follow-up. But why do electrons have magnetic moments? Okay, a much deeper question. But Feynman could handle it.
He dives into quantum mechanics, electron spin. He's still on solid ground here. But the interviewer, he wasn't done. He asked again.
But why does quantum mechanics work that way? And right there, that's where Feynman hits a wall. You could see him get visibly frustrated on camera. But here's the key. It wasn't because he didn't know the answer. It was because the question itself had stopped making sense. This is what's known as the why trap. It's a chain of questions called an infinite regress. See, you can keep asking why, peeling back layer after layer until you finally hit a fundamental law of the universe. And at that point, you can't ask why anymore, because that law is the deepest explanation we have. It just is.
Feynman actually had a great analogy for this, using slippery ice. He said, look, if my Aunt Mabel asks me why ice is slippery, I can give her a simple answer. Like, oh, because there's a thin layer of water on the surface. That's perfect for her. It's satisfying, it's basically true. But if a physicist asks him the same question, that answer's totally useless. They need to know about the deep molecular mechanics, pressure melting, all that stuff. The point is, the right answer always depends on who's asking and what level of understanding they're looking for.
So, what's the big lesson in all of this? What's the takeaway? I think it's that Feynman's real genius wasn't about knowing everything. Far from it. It was in his profound, deep comfort with not knowing. He was comfortable with doubt, with uncertainty, and with exploring those beautiful, fuzzy edges of our collective knowledge.
So let's just bring it all home. What can we learn from this? First, have the courage to just admit when you don't know something. That's where it all starts. Then, start building your understanding brick by brick, using those so-called dumb questions. And please, don't ever be afraid of looking a little slow if it means you're going to gain real insight. Remember that even a question as powerful as why has its limits. And maybe most importantly of all, learn to see doubt not as a weakness to be afraid of, but as the true engine of all discovery.
And we'll end on this one simple but incredibly powerful idea from Feynman himself. It is possible to live and not know. You know, in a world that just screams at us to have all the answers, to be certain about everything, he reminds us that there's this profound freedom in simply accepting that we don't. So many of us are absolutely terrified of not knowing. But for Feynman, that was where the real adventure always began. Because it's not just possible to live and not know, it's the only way we ever truly learn anything at all.